Welcome, 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 friend. I'm TK, your tour guide to the past, and you are listening to For the Love of History, the podcast where we talk about world history, women's history, weird history, and today we have our resident archaeologist, is what I'm just going to call Hannah now, because that's what she is. She's been on the podcast 3 times at this point, and we are so lucky to have her and thankful that she is here to spread all of her various knowledges to us. We've talked about cements and plasters and concrete. We've talked about copies and seals and forgeries and counterfeits and things like that. And today we are talking about pigment, which is all around us all the time. You cannot escape pigment. And why would you want to escape pigment? So today, Hannah is going to tell us all about pigment. Thank you for joining us, Hannah.
Hi again. So, it occurs to me that you call your podcast listeners delicious donuts.
Yes.
I want to point out that you may also call your Canadian-specific listeners Timbits, because that is the Tim Hortons little round donut hole confection. That's what they're called. So,
oh my gosh,
throwing that out there to you.
No, I'm taking it.
Timbits are important to me. So, but anyways, so just a quick reintroduction of myself. I'm Hannah. I'm an archaeologist. I'm finishing and working on a PhD right now at Simon Fraser University, and mostly I study ancient technology. I became interested in pigments and colors because I have tried basically any basic art and craft that you can think of. So like watercolor. And I'm an illustrator as well. And so when I became interested in learning how to do watercolor, I learned that there was some sort of history of colors and pigments, and it really drew my attention, and I wanted to know all the things and about all the colors that have accidentally killed people, and it's great. It's true. So we're gonna talk about colors today, and I'm gonna learn you a thing. And Taya and I discussed this, and you're gonna have to learn some things. You're gonna have to learn some things before we can tell you the most awesome things. So today we're gonna learn about things like the visible light spectrum and how eyeballs see color. And it's very exciting. So to preface all this, I have one question for you, and then we're gonna do a pop quiz. I'm gonna pop quiz you. So My first question for you is, what is your favorite color?
My favorite color is orange.
That's a good color. I like it. I'm not sure what my favorite color is, but I think it's like forest green. Maybe it's But anyway, so I have 3 questions for you, and we're going to see if you somehow magically already know the answer, which you may. And they're all about colors and pigments. Pigments are specific things that are used to make things a different color. A bit strange to say. So there's 2 sort of classes of things that make things other colors first, by the way. Pigments, which are usually something that is insoluble in water. They have a binder added to them, and then you make it into like a paint, for example, like a watercolor paint. You also have dyes, which are things that are soluble in water, and then you make it into a dye bath like you would with tie dyeing, which I'm sure many of us have done with great joy. So, but colors, we're just talking about what we see visually, nothing to do with what it's made out of in particular. So my first question for you on this pop quiz is, what came first? Orange, the fruit, or the color orange? The color name orange. In the English language specifically.
Okay, in the English language specifically, I'm going to go with orange, the fruit, and not orange, the color.
So that is correct. So color orange didn't exist until like the earliest mention that we have of it is 1502 as like the color orange, because fruit oranges, they originated in China and then were brought through Europe. And so before that, people would refer to a color that is orange, that is this color, I have this scarf here, as yellow-red.
Oh. And
although orange rhymes with nothing, it is, a little bit smoother. So that's fun. So you get a gold star for that. So my second is, what animal was Marie Antoinette's favorite color named after?
What?
Right? Isn't that oddly specific?
That's so specific. I'm just going to try to think about the colors of the time, like the Marie Antoinette-esque colors. Raven? Black? Like raven?
A reasonable good guess, but no, the correct answer is actually a flea.
A flea? A flea?
So Marie Antoinette's favorite color was what we call today puce, like that sort of real muted, dusty rose kind of color. Apparently, her husband, King Louis XVI, was kind of like making fun of her and throwing shade. And she's like, "Get me another dress in this color." And so he's like, "I got to get her another dress the color of fleas." And so that's why part of the reason we call it puce now, because she wore it. And so people were into it. Puce.
I love that.
Yeah, so it's fun, right? And so
Yeah.
The last one is another one about word origins. So the word miniature was derived from a specific color. Do you know what color that was?
Miniature? Maybe gray? I don't know, like mini black? I don't know.
No, so is your favorite color orange? So there was a specific pigment color that was called minium. And it was used by like these monks that were doing all of this artwork for manuscript making. And because they were using minium, the little doohickeys that they drew for like the top of the title or like the big first letter of the page, they did in that pretty bright red orange ink called minium. So they called miniatura, which we got from that the word miniature.
Oh my gosh, that's
Isn't
so
that
cool.
interesting? And like you
That's
don't
so
even
interesting.
yeah, it's awesome. It's awesome.
That's
So
really cool.
we learned some things. We talked about orange. That was great.
Orange is my favorite color, and I'm glad to know it has a cool history.
Right? It's actually my favorite shade of orange that has that. It's like that almost poppy red orange. Oh, I love it. Right? And these things and more, this is a major source that I use when doing my research for this, and it's a book that I love. The Secret Lives of Color by Cassia St. Clair. And it is like an amazing coffee table book because it has like colors and different, like tons of information, but also it tells you the specific information about specific different colors, like shocking pink or scarlet or Egyptian blue, which we'll talk about later. So now that we see that this could potentially be an interesting conversation about color, first we have to kind of talk about in a little bit more of a scientific aspect. In order to understand pigments and dyes, we have to understand a little bit about the visible light spectrum and how humans perceive it. So the visible light spectrum is sort of this rainbow of colors that you see: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple. And it goes from 380 to 700 nanometers. And what does that mean? Light, which is where we get color from, come in waves. So the numbers that I just said, 380 to 700 nanometers, are the width of those different wavelengths. And when we see things, we get light at certain wavelengths. It hits specific cells in our eyeballs called cones. And once the light hits those cones, the cones get all excited, and then they tell our brains to perceive color. So humans have 3 different types of cones, and each of these cones overlaps with another. So like you can't say that one is really red and one is the green cone, the blue, because they do overlap. But this is sort of how we get a mix of different colors, and that's why you might hear of someone being red-green colorblind, because in their red and green cone receptors they don't tickle the brain right, so they don't get that information. So that's sort of how about light and how humans perceive it. But this does leave some really things that I think are super interesting. So one thing that I learned about when I learned about the visible light spectrum years and years ago is that there are colors that fall outside of the visible light spectrum. So, you know the color magenta, sort of a very vibrant, right in between like purple and red?
Yeah.
Technically, that color doesn't exist.
Okay.
So it's outside of the visible light spectrum. So how we see it basically is that our brain gets some information from the really, really long waves that make up the red end of the spectrum, and it gets some information from the really short wave section, the blue, purple wave section of the visible light spectrum, and it kind of puts those things together, and it makes you think this is we perceive it as this sort of magenta color, but it doesn't actually exist.
What?
Right? It's interesting. And there are also different colors that in theory could exist based on color models. So anyone who is listening is familiar with like making graphics for computer or for print. You know, you have specific color spaces that you have to use. You can either use the RGB color space designed for screens, which is red, green, blue, or you can use the CMYK color space, which is designed for print. And do you know what all of the letters in CMYK stand for?
I think so. C is cerulean, right?
No.
No. C is, hold on.
You're in the right color family, though.
Cyan.
Yeah.
Okay, cyan. And then a Y is yellow.
Yeah.
Yes. Why did I do the easiest one first? And then K, cobalt.
Cobalt starts with E in English, so no. So M stands for magenta, because even though I said that magenta isn't real, what I mean by that is it's outside of the visible spectrum of light. So it does exist. Magenta things obviously exist. I've seen them, so have you. But the K stands for key, K-E-Y.
Okay.
Which is how they are addressing black.
Oh.
Which is something that I had to learn years ago when I worked in an office for a PhD department, and I had to learn about color spaces and things like this. And I was like, what is the K? It's so
nice. Or cobalt with a K.
So there are actually other colors that don't exist. They're called sometimes, they're not what they call them. They're not extra spectral colors like magenta, but they don't really exist, but your brain can make you think they exist. So have you ever done you stared at a bright light for too long and then you look away to something else and you see different colors sort of in your eye spectrum? So in this way, your eye sort of tricks itself into believing that there are other colors. So one of these colors that doesn't really exist, but you can make your eyes believe it exists, is called Stygian blue. And it's when you look for a really long time at something yellowish, and then you look at something that is black right after. And so the yellow opposite on the color wheel is kind of a bluish color, bluish purple. And so your eyes will make you think that when you're looking at something black, after you've looked at this yellow thing for a very long time, there's this part of your eyeball that is like, opposite of yellow, purple. And so you look at this black thing and you see this blue that is just as dark or darker than black, which is not possible because blue is lighter.
What? That's crazy.
You look and you think about it, like those are technically colors that don't exist. And sometimes if you look at things that are green for a really long time and then you look at something that is white, the green opposite of that is red. And so your eye thinks it's seeing red overlaid on top of this white, but the red seems just as bright as white, which is not possible.
So crazy. It's like the optical illusion things,
it's very much exactly like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Or when you were a little kid and you rubbed your eyes really hard, or when we all did weird things with our eyeballs when we were kids, or maybe that was just me.
Okay, me too. Don't worry.
You stare at something like those swirly thingies, the spirals, and then you'd look somewhere else, or you would look at those black and white pictures and you'd look somewhere else, and it would make
a reverse inverted kind of situation.
Exactly.
So I think that covers the majority of you had to learn some science first things. Is that it's all light. Color is light. When you see a rainbow, that is all of the color that is in the visible spectrum. And you can love magenta, but it's not technically in the visible spectrum. So that's fine.
Got it.
Now we can talk about what color means to us as humans. And one way that I found this to be totally fascinating is through language. And I learned about this phenomena because when I was doing my bachelor's at university, I took 3 years of Russian language. Now, me, as someone who does not work in Russia and knows very few Russian people, it is essentially only useful for eavesdropping on people on public transit. So when I was learning Russian, as one does when they are learning language in a setting that's a formal setting, like a classroom, you got to learn your alphabet and your letters and your basic I, me, you, mom, dad, brother, numbers, but you also learn your colors. And in Russian, I learned that they, in fact, use 2 separate words to describe the color blue. So this is the English equivalent, because we're speaking English right now, and I assume that your listeners are therefore at least conversationally able to communicate in English. In English, we use, when we talk about our basic rainbow colors, we use red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple. Russian language has 2 words for blue. One of them is specifically for a light shade of blue, which is goluboy. What it is, lighter type blue. Maybe you can think of it in your mind as sky blue. And for darker blue, it is siny. These are held out as distinctly 2 different colors. They are not the same thing. As English speakers, we would say light blue, or we would say dark blue, but we don't have light blue and dark blue in our basic rainbow of colors. We don't do that. But this is actually very common in other languages to have these sort of, it's called sification. So they're co-lexified. It means that you're using different words for, well, I guess that means you're using the same word for multiple things, which is a different can of worms we'll get to next. But that, for whatever reason, when Russian language was developing, there developed two separate words that were held out as common colors for the word blue. And they've actually done studies wherein they've had people who were native Russian speakers and those who weren't. And the people who were native Russian speakers could make a decision faster about whether something that they were shown, whether it was light blue or dark blue. So as non-Russian speakers, and I don't know how useful that skill would be in a life or death situation, but it does give you some ideas that, wow, like the words that we use every day to describe colors impacts how we think to some degree. And it's really interesting. And I was like, wow, like I can't imagine having another color in our scheme. But I realized when I was thinking about this that English does this too, but we do it with the color red. We have red and pink as separate colors, even though pink is kind of just a lighter color red. But we distinct words for them. This is pink and this is red. We don't call something that's pink, we don't ever call it red. Although, if there's a reddish sort of pink, very hot pink sort of color, maybe you might call it red or pink, but there's definitely a distinction, I feel. But then there's this colexifying phenomenon that happens, and it happens most often with languages that they use the same words for shades of green and blue. And I think this is fascinating. And I know that one of them is modern Japanese, and we were talking about this, and you were telling me a good story. So why don't you tell me some more about your experiences with not having a word for the color green?
Yeah, for sure. So mini Japanese lesson. Green in Japanese is midori. That's just your basic green. And then blue in Japanese is ao. And when I was learning how to drive, I was doing my road test, whatever, going out, looking at the traffic signals, and it's red, green, yellow, right? Or red, yellow, green, or whatever order the traffic signals are.
Hopefully
I can't think of it right now. So when I was going, thankfully, I was still on the practice course because I was in the car and the guy was like, "Ao ni natta toki, ite yo," and which means when the light turns green, air quotes, green, you can go. But he said ao, which is blue in Japanese. So I waited at the light for the light to turn blue. I thought, okay, Japanese traffic lights have a special fourth color, which is blue. That's cool. And then I just sat there. And the guy was like, ao yo, ao. And I was like, no, it's not. It's not. This is green. I was like, no, midori. And he was like, no. Oh, like, gosh darn it. So yeah, for most things, unless you are being very specific with talking about the color green, if you are out in the world and you see something that's green, they're gonna say blue instead of green.
So maybe an instance where you would use midori is when I was like, oh, I want a new shirt, but I want it to be like the color of your shirt, which she's wearing this lovely sort of chartreuse colored top. It's a dress, but it's a top versus my shirt, which also could be green, but it's a blue-green.
Yeah, so. Exactly. So another example is for green apples, Granny Smith apples. Instead of being called green apples like they are in English, they're called ao ringo. Ao is blue, ringo is apple. So they're called blue apples.
Oh, that's so strange. But every language has this own little thing, but it's just another example of color having different meanings.
So interesting, right?
And if you want to even blow your mind a little bit more, one phrase that is sort of very popular from Homer's works as he describes the wine dark sea. About you, but when I look at the ocean, I do not consider it to be the color of wine.
No, same.
It just wouldn't make any sense. But so they also have other instances of writing where they describe honey, like the sweet stuff, as being green. And like, they're also like, oh yeah, by the way, it's strange. There's more on this later when we talk about more about the color green, so I won't go too into it. But basically, the ancient Greeks, the way they conceived of light and color in the world is that white was at one end and black was at another end, and yellow was just a little bit darker than white, and blue was a little bit lighter than black, and red and green were in the middle somewhere.
What?
Yeah, it's vaguely interchangeable. It's a lot of people who study ancient Greek writings just have a hard time with this. And if you read them as someone who's an English speaker, it's super funny. And we'll get more up until that later, but it's just one more thing that is just wild.
So we have all of this information about colors, but I want to know how archaeologists study pigments. How do we do that?
Yes. So people who might study pigments are people outside of archaeologists too. There are people like who work in museums, like art historians, who want to understand the works that they have in their collections more. They also have people who are, for example, conservators, who are taking care of often older, important historic works of art, either on the outside of buildings, like frescoes, or inside museums, and they need to best take care of them, or they need to understand what the thing actually is. Yeah. And of course, people like me, who are archaeologists, who are just really interested in people from the past and their garbage. And sometimes those pieces of garbage have pigment on them. So the shortest way to answer this question is lasers, which is how I think of it. I think of this as science lasers. And in my mind, this is a category of several different types of analysis that basically involve you pointing something at a target, and it's not really a laser, unfortunately, unless you're doing something which is laser ablation, which I do not do. But a bunch of different types of things that have fancy names. So there are some things that, and they all have abbreviations too. I published a paper, and I talked about lots of different ways that people study ancient lime plaster production, because that's what I am working on for my thesis. And I have a whole appendix that's like a good page long. This is what all of the abbreviations in this paper, because there's so many. But one of the first ways is XRF, which stands for X-ray fluorescence. You shoot X-rays at something, and certain chemicals, certain molecules will fluoresce. I guess this way, XRF deals mostly with specific elements. So it will tell you that something has calcium in it, but it won't tell you the molecule that calcium is made out of. So it'll say, I'm fluorescing in a certain way, and you can measure it, and you can find out that that's calcium.
The science people, man. That's so cool. Yeah.
So there's another way to shoot lasers at things that is called Raman spectroscopy, and it's just using a different type of fluorescence to get things excited. It measures it, same thing. The type of lasering, science lasers, that I use for my research is called FTIR, and this stands for Fourier transform. And that phrase itself just has to deal with the type of way that we go from spectra of light to data. It's just the way that. So don't get stuck there. Infrared spectroscopy. So it's using infrared light and this specific way of manipulating that data to give you information about chemical bonds between two different elements. So why I use this is it'll tell me that, in this thing that's being shot a laser at, there's a bond between calcium and carbon. And there's another bond between oxygen and carbon. So you can put that information together and it'll shoot up different peaks on a graph. And you can say, that's calcite, for example. So you can use these things to tools like these, and there's other things. There's using thin sections, looking at things under a microscope, and a number of different ways to study these things to find out basically what is this thing that I'm looking at. Because we want to know not only what is this pigment, what is the thing that makes this colorful, but we also might want to know what is the binder? How are these molecules stuck together so that they can sit on something like a beautiful fresco or a painted. Cool. But that also helps us again we can also see how well is this thing preserved? Is it going to fall apart if I so much as look at it? But under, certain lighting conditions, so UV rays from the sun don't do anything. So that's a lot of how we study it is so cool. Short form, what is this thing with lasers that aren't actually lasers? But I like a little whimsy in my life, so I like to think of them as science lasers.
Hey, we call scientists science people here. So science lasers, it fits right under the umbrella of science things.
And you can be both. You can be a science person and a history person and an art person and a cat person. It's good.
We're multi-dimensional people.
So we know about what colors are in terms of light, and we know about some interesting things about how we think about colors, and we know how scientists study colors. And now we can talk about some of the earliest colors. And we can talk about our homie, and by homie, I mean person who we disagree with because he's kind of a little shit, Pliny the Elder.
Pliny the Elder.
But yeah, at one point he's like, the only colors we have are red, white, black, and yellow. Even though this was definitely at least 2,000 years after the invention of like things of using blue and green pigments, by the Egyptians. So he was exaggerating. He was definitely making stuff up.
Yeah.
But there is sort of a grain of truth there, because the earliest pigments that people are using to make things, and we're talking like 50,000 years ago, beyond 50,000 years ago. So think of that, but then think of even older, because the earliest example we have of figural art, which means that art that represents something, it's not just splotches, it's not abstract, is 51,000 years old. It's in a cave in Indonesia, and it is a picture of a human and 3 pigs. But in order to make these things, you need some type of pigment.
Yeah.
So in your mind, you can think of the very sort of stereotypical cave art that has a handprint, maybe like a cow or something. These are made with pigments. And the earliest pigments were things that people could essentially just pick up and start using. And the way that I kind of think about this is, when I was little, and I'm sure many other people did too, if I was on the playground and I found a rock and I rubbed it on the cement and I was like, oh, I can see this. Yeah. I mean, it may not have been a pigment, but I could make something visible with something that I just found on the ground, on the cement or whatever it was. And so a lot of these things were shades of brown and gray and yellow and a little bit of red. So you have things like hematite and magnetite, which are both minerals. Hematite is usually more of a bit of a gray. Magnetite's a bit, or maybe that's the other way around. Either way, hematite and magnetite. But also there's ochre. Ochre is the big one. And ochre is real big in archaeology, because people have been using that, again, for just about 50,000 years. And it comes in all different colors. You have yellow ochre and red ochre and regular ochre. It's interesting. I can think of, there's this big old lump of ochre that has a bunch of like incised scrapes on it that was from the Paleolithic. So I'm thinking that one is at least 30,000 years ago. But in the field of doing archaeology, I found lumps of ochre, like yellow and red, and then just little balls of things, and they were used for color.
Whoa.
They're just a mineral. They're just like a sort of clayey textured rock.
I remember ochre from watching like old Bob Ross shows, and he'd be like, okay, we're going to use a little bit of yellow ochre or whatever ochre.
Ochre is and it's, while a lot of modern like paints that are used, especially if you're not like a professional artist, they're not going to be made from these same pigments like ochre, but they're synthetics imitating that yellow ochre shade, which is really cool, because again, it like connects you to these thousands and thousands of years ago. So the other 2 colors or pigments that we used made the colors black and white. I'm going to see, could you posit a guess about how black and white were made into artwork 50,000 years ago?
So if I go with like how black is made in some of the most oldest tattoos that we have, it's some sort of carbon. So like soot or something.
Like charcoal. Exactly. Yeah. So,
and then white, is it some sort of like like talc or calcite or something like that?
Your brain's in the right. You're thinking calcium, calcite, because that's what I deal with. But chalk, which is a limestone that is made, that's basically pure calcite. So that's how they made white, because if you mix that with some water, it's basically the sort of what people used as the base for lots of frescoes later on in history.
Nice.
Yeah, those were like the oldest pigments that were being used by people, and you can kind of envision this color palette in your head of like black, white, red, yellow, and these are sort of some very, in general, most cultures globally did sort of start off with these colors as their basic color box, painter's palette, so to say, because they were just there. You didn't have to do anything to make them happen. They're totally natural pigments. But later on, and I'm going to say, about 25,000 years later, just a little bit later, we do eventually get people making synthetic pigments. And you know me, I am absolutely on board with people making synthetic materials. I think it's fascinating. They take something that's natural that they found and they made it into something else. And this time we have the ancient Egyptians around 3500 BCE. So from today, that is like 5,000 years ago, making the color Egyptian blue. In my notes, which you have, I refer to it as a sexy standout of colors from the ancient world, because it's just so cool. It's this gorgeous, vibrant synthetic blue. And it is a calcium copper silicate. So that means it's made from bits of copper and calcium, as well as silica. And it is often a byproduct of like copper ore manufacturing. But they made this gorgeous, gorgeous blue that's really long lasting. And if you look at ancient Egyptian monuments that are still out in there today, which I personally have seen, this blue color is still preserved. You can see some parts of it, you can see how vibrant it was. It's really cool. So the ancient Egyptians, in their worldview, like we would today, find a lot of value in fine materials. Fine materials that they found a lot of value in were the gemstones turquoise and lapis lazuli. Now, they had turquoise out on the Sinai Peninsula, but lapis lazuli was probably imported from what is today Afghanistan. That's sort of the consensus about a lot of sourcing studies of lapis lazuli. But lapis is dark, deep blue. It was the inspiration for later, I'm talking like modern history, people to manufacture the pigment ultramarine. So it's deep, vibrant blue. And these two things were lapis lazuli and turquoise were associated with the goddess Hathor.
Oh,
because one of her titles was, let me make sure I read this right, Lady of Mefkat. So she was like the goddess of all blue-green gemstones. So sort of that. And the thing is, though, is that turquoise and lapis lazuli were comparatively rare. You had to go somewhere to get them or mine them, bring them back. And so finding a way to replicate these colors in a way that was much more accessible and easier to do was obviously going to be a good bonus. So the faience, which is not itself a pigment, that's this very characteristic turquoise sort of material that's made by ancient Egyptians. And that was sort of one of their stand-ins for turquoise that they had because they could manufacture it. But for Egyptian blue, this was their gateway to get lapis lazuli. Fine blue pigment color, reminiscent of lapis lazuli and, the heavens and all of these things there. And in fact, the ancient Egyptian name for lapis lazuli, or not lapis lazuli, for Egyptian blue meant artificial lapis lazuli. So like, very clear about what was going on. But it's this gorgeous blue. And something that I think is super cool about it is that it actually fluoresces. If you're looking at it with invisible light, it will fluoresce on the infrared spectrum.
So cool.
If you have the right equipment, this is really handy for people who want to study ancient Egyptian objects to see if they have Egyptian blue on them without even touching them. You just get your infrared spectra, camera or whatever on, and you can see it, like it'll flag up. So, and something that I think is absolutely hilarious, but also very cool, is that they have done studies using the synthesized pigment Egyptian blue as to like pick up fingerprints in a forensic context because it fluoresces in the infrared spectrum, right? It's really funny because you would get to see that in infrared, but what would everything look like if you were just viewing it with your own eyeballs? It would be everything's dusted in bright blue,
right? Yeah.
Like, how cool is that? And that was in a 2016 study. So this is the cutting edge new stuff, man.
That is so cool. That's so interesting. So we've got this new sexy color on the scene. We've got Egyptian blue. And then what other colors kind of popped up? These sexy colors. What do we have after Egyptian blue?
So I'm going to be honest with you. Part of my fascination with colors, especially like the earliest inventions of new pigments to use beyond the things that you get from the earth, are people making pigments from really weird stuff and being totally normal and like, this is what this is made from. So another pigment that the ancient Egyptians used was called orpiment. It is this gorgeous, like golden yellow.
Ooh.
Very beautiful. It is what the walls of King Tut's tombs are painted with orpiment to give them this, basically as close as you can get to gold while still being not metallic, which is wonderful, but it is made out of arsenic. So maybe don't lick the walls in King Tut's tombs. It's probably right. So it's
okay.
It's great. But another one is the color sepia. The pigment sepia, I guess. And we sort of think about this as like the sort of brown tone you get in like old-timey photographs. But the pigment sepia is actually a little bit blacker than that. And it's derived from cuttlefish ink, right? So you get it from cuttlefish ink. And there was a big debate back in the day of how do you separate your ink from your cuttlefish? And, not ideal, right? No.
Gross.
That's not one that I'm glad that I don't feel that I need to use cuttlefish ink to do things. But that was
Glad
how
we have synthetic cuttlefish ink now.
So another one, which I also kind of find it fascinating when these things that are, made to be pigments to give us color in the world are actually like poisonous and bad for you. And so another big synthetic pigment that was made in ancient times was lead white. So they're making white from lead. And the way that they did this is they had like these specific containers to do it. And somehow it would involve getting your strips of lead metal, and you had to combine it with vinegar and dung, so poo, and just sort of let that hang out for a while, ferment. You get this white stuff from it that you could use as a pigment. And lead white has been big in the world, across the world, in different cultures for a very long time after the ancient Romans were messing with it. Queen Elizabeth I used lead white makeup.
Yeah.
And so you want to put lead right on your face. It's a great idea, everyone. No, it's not.
No.
Don't use lead-based things for your body. That's not a good time. But it's crazy. Like this started thousands of years before her, and they've got white color. That's one way they could make it. And they already had other ways to make white, but they just, thought that was
like poop and vinegar. Let's do it.
The magic. It's an alchemy, and we'll get to that later. Another color. We're going to shift to the section that I call the reds.
Oh,
the colors, because the reds I find funny. So one shade of red called vermilion was made from the mineral cinnabar, which is poisonous, right? But the getting of this pigment vermilion, which is like a red shade, from the cinnabar was very much like it was alchemy coated, as the kids might say. So that's alchemy. That's wild. How do we do this? Can we make gold from? Because the alchemists always want to make gold from things. So
yeah,
it was very heavily associated with alchemy. And again, we'll talk about alchemy later. So there's that. There's already that. That's kind of like, that's a little woo, but okay. But the other two reds that I'm thinking of are Kermes red, which is also called scarlet, which is made from bugs that are ground up a little bit. And what's pretty wild is that Pliny the Elder once again talks about grinding up these bugs to make them into this red dye. But what's also fascinating is that there is another shade of red made in ancient times that was also made by bugs that are relatives to them on the other side of the world. So in Central and South America, they were making cochineal red or carmine. Yeah. And I think you've talked about this on like an Instagram reel before. Yeah. So you got all these snail bugs, and then you crush them all up, and then it's a red dye. And
it's such a pretty red dye too.
70,000 insects to make 1 pound of pigment, which is not ideal.
No, I feel bad about that. I'm sorry.
So I mentioned earlier that I used to work in an office doing like graphic design stuff for this department when I was at the University of Arizona. And that's when I learned about color space. But that's when I also learned about color branding. And if you're using the University of Arizona logo at the time, which was like, again, oh my God, it was 10 years ago. You had to use the specific patented chosen colors that were the University of Arizona colors. And the red was cochineal red. And I was like, what is that? And so that's when I Googled it and I learned. And it was chosen for that particular red because they live on prickly pear cacti. So that's
so cool. It all comes together.
All come together, right? It's great. And so that was our red section. But then we also have this one. I'm not exactly sure when it came up, when it was first originated, but it uses the same process essentially as lead white. And so I think it might have been Roman, but I could be wrong. Don't quote me on this. Is the color verdigris, which is, think of something that's coppered and it gets that sort of light blue green, the Statue of Liberty, that color was made from. One way that you did it was you do it essentially the same way as you make lead white. You put some stuff in a container and you let it ferment. But instead of using vinegar, you could use sour wine instead.
Oh.
Your copper to make verdigris. So it's that. It sounds like a lot of really smelly things.
So smelly. So very smelly.
And part of that is because you often have to use, when you're dyeing things, when you're making a pigment into a dye and you're dyeing fabric, you have to use something called a mordant. Something that will help your little dye chemicals stick to whatever you're dyeing. And this is why when I was growing up, I grew up in the US and we would dye Easter eggs.
Yeah.
And it would always smell like vinegar because you had to add vinegar to the dye so that it would stick to the eggs, right? Because vinegar can be as a mordant.
Yeah.
However, in a lot of cases in pre-industrial times, it was not uncommon for people to use urine as a mordant, so like stanky.
Oh, don't like
smell,
that.
Right? Which actually brings me to, we're going to say, a sexy standout of the ancient colors, and that color is Tyrian purple.
Tyrian purple.
After the city of Tyre in Lebanon, which in ye olde ancient times was Phoenicia, is where that was. And Tyrian purple is like this lovely sort of reddish purple. It's royal purple. It's imperial purple. It's also sometimes called Murex purple.
Oh.
Because that was what they thought that the snails were made out of. And I'll get to those snails.
Okay.
But it's also called shellfish purple. And this was a real big deal. So they made it in about 1200 BCE is when they're made. And they're making this beautiful purple dye, but how are they making it? My friend, they were like, you see those predatory sea snails over there? If I scare that sea snail or if I crush it, it's purple. I want that purple. I want to wear that on my body.
Want that purple? No.
Yeah. So like these predatory sea snails, they used to be called murex, but they're actually 3 different types of snails apparently. Okay. And the purple bits are their mucuses, their secretions from a specific gland. When they shoot it out, when they want to get their prey, to stun them, or when they're agitated. So in ancient times, they would often just crush the sea snail to get it out.
Oh no!
Which leads to problems. But apparently, you can also do this by like activating the gland and essentially milking a snail.
I hate it. I hate everything that you just said.
Right? So there's no evidence that I'm aware of that they were milking snails in the ancient Mediterranean. I think they were just crushing them. But yeah, so if you imagine the urine with like this fishy guts smell, really delightful smelling of your beautiful purple robes. And yeah, so it's this really popular color. People love it. But it does take 10,000 little snailsies to make one grain dye. Or I actually found this in 2 different sources. One was from BBC and one was an English North American source. So I can also say that it would take 250,000 snails to make 1 ounce of dye. So pick your poison. But in Roman times, it was written that it was worth 3 times its weight in gold.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's a big deal. Yeah. Very shiny, iridescent purple. And because of how much these took, how many snails needed to give their lives for people to wear a very sexy purple color,
oh my God,
there's some scientific evidence that suggests that the snail populations may have declined due to this. So when they've done some excavations of these big, huge piles of predatory snail shells. Yeah.
What?
Right? And the ones at the bottom were markedly larger than the ones at the top. So they think that that could suggest that there just simply were fewer and fewer snails left to make this from.
Oh my gosh.
But that's fine because, eventually one suggestion is that cardinals used to wear this color, cardinals in the Catholic Church. And then they switched to red later because that wasn't available. Yeah. But a little bit before then, we're going to circle back to the Roman and we're going to talk about one of my favorite things. I think it's very humorous as someone who got to grow up in North America is sumptuary laws. So sumptuary laws are all about who can use or wear what. And it depends on your status. Yeah. So the Tyrian purple was called like imperial purple because only so-and-so was so important to be able to use this thing. So this Tyrian purple was subject to this. Tyrian purple was so just craved and exciting. Not only was it super expensive to make and manufacture and buy, but it could potentially be very expensive to wear because some Roman emperors apparently decreed that the only person during this time who could wear this Tyrian purple were the emperors. And if you wore it and you were not emperor, they would kill you. So,
oh my gosh.
People very into fashion.
Whoa.
Very fashion, these Roman emperors. Some of the Roman, there was one Roman emperor, and I'm not sure which one it was. I don't remember. But he was like, you know what? Anyone can wear this color if they can afford it. And if they're going to buy it, they got to give the money to me. So it's very much like this purple is this kind of fancy, which, is funny. After the Romans that have this sort of deep fascination, love, and fervor for this Tyrian purple, the Byzantines, just, next door, also get really, really into it. And they love it. Everyone who's, a royal gets to wear the purple. They had the Catholic cardinals, or what would be the Catholic cardinals wearing purple, because it's very high status. What you wear, again, has to deal with what your status is in life. And I was talking with my husband about, I'm going to, talk with Taya about colors, and this is what I'm going to say. And I was telling him about this Tyrian purple, and he's like, oh, do you know about the porphyrogenitos? And I was like, no, tell me more. So my husband loves history also, but he often likes a different period of history than me. So the porphyrogenitos, that's a Greek word. It can also be anglicized to porphyrogeniture.
Okay.
Like a thing that starts about the 6th century CE in the Byzantine Empire. And it means porphyrogenitos, born in the purple. You can think of it as kind of it was sometimes used to describe people who had the right to wear this Tyrian purple, but it could also very specifically refer to individuals who were literally born in a specific purple room in the Grand Palace in Constantinople.
What?
Which was purple, right? So my brother. And so my husband learned about this through a piece of writing called the Alexiad, which was written by a woman, Anna Komnene, during the Byzantine Empire. And it was written about the period of time where her father was a ruler. But she talks this purple room, they had to go be born in the purple room. And I was born in the purple room. And so they're literally being born into a room that is purple. And the room is purple because the walls are made out of a type of rock called porphyry. Which often has kind of like a reddy purple color. Yeah, so it's this special room where they're just knocking out babies, and these babies fancy babies. Gosh. Right? So it's this big deal that you have the Byzantine emperors and their children and nobles talking about being born in the purple in a figurative way, but then also being a literal purple room that is all interconnected to this mucus made by these sea snails, which is wild. And apparently, something that I found really fascinating was apparently in the Americas, you have indigenous cultures there who are using related predatory snails that have purple goo. And instead of doing mean things to them, they just let these sea snails slither all over the fabric that they want to dye, and it just dyes the fabric that way.
What? So, that's so cool.
Right. And if you do research about Tyrian purple, it'll say the mix is lost to history because when the Ottomans Empire sort of collapsed, they stopped using this Tyrian purple as much. And the specifics of how much of it did they combine with what to make the dye, to make it into a thing, are something that aren't currently written down right now. So people are trying to figure out, well, how did they make it? But essentially, we do know that it's made from this mucus from sea snails.
Snail mucus is so versatile because it's a thing. It's started versatile. You can use it on your face as a natural Botox is what people say. It's like a smoothing agent. And I have snail mucin in my bathroom right now. Korean snail mucin that I rub on my face. Thankfully, it's not purple or blue, rather.
It's this big, huge tail, and it's just crazy. But you think about it, royal purple is still a common way to describe certain shades of purple today. Or
exactly.
Have you draw a picture of a queen, or there's a queen in animated movies. She's often drawn as wearing purple.
Yeah,
I like purple. I'm a fan. I like to get my purple unadulterated with sea snail mucus, but
not have the sea snail mucus, that'd be great.
Yeah. So moving on to yet slightly later in history, another color with questionable means of production is the color Indian yellow. It has many other names, but in English language, it's called Indian yellow, and it's this nice, sunshiny, slightly orangey yellow. It's very nice. I like it, but the pigment Indian yellow isn't manufactured anymore. And there are very few examples of it that exist now. And I will tell you the reason why. So this pigment first starts showing up, as far as we can tell, in 16th to 19th century CE in Indian artworks of the Mughal period, right? So you've got this gorgeous luminescent yellow. And they're like, ooh, this is nice. And much like the British do, they say, ooh, you have that. It is nice. I want it. European artists are like, oh, I'm going to buy some of this from you and use this yellow color too. And it's a really funny story because some sources that I read said that people didn't know what it was made of in Europe. But they're like, it's really smelly. We think maybe it's made of pee. And so the botanist who was working with the Kew Garden, it was in the 1880s, and it is Sir Joseph Hooker, who also had a shade of green named after him, which is Hooker's Green. But
I love that.
Yeah, neither here nor there. But he wrote to someone that he knew in India, and he was like, dear so-and-so, what is this thing made out of? I must know. And, finally he gets the response back, and this letter says that, oh yeah, talked to a bunch of people, and we found out that Indian yellow was made, at least suspected, yes, from urine. It was made from the pee of a specific herd of cows in a specific rural village in India. And these cows were malnourished, and they had only been fed mango leaves. So, yeah, I know. So that's part of the reason it's not made anymore, because you don't want to mistreat cows in order to make this. But so basically they had these cows and they were only fed mangoes, and they were poor, sad, malnourished cows that didn't pee that much. But when they did, it was a very, yellowy color. And just a reminder, hydrate. Hydration's good. If
exactly
your pee is yellow, you should drink some water. I'm going to drink some water just in case.
I'm going to drink. It's a different kind of hydration. It's coffee, but still.
It counts. It's got water in it.
Exactly.
But anyways, so they got the report that this pee was collected into a cup, and then they concentrated it. They filtered out all of the solidy bits because they wanted those. They dried that out over the fire and in the sun, and then they sort of formed that into little balls, which were then sold as pigments. And then people further sorted them out and be like, this one's too green, whatever. So that was Indian yellow.
Wow.
And you can't if you buy Indian yellow now, it's just the color. It's not the same pigment. It's artificially made because we don't want to be intentionally malnourishing any cows to make this.
Yeah, no, thank you. Why is so much of pigment history full of animal death and gross smelling things and just not good stuff?
Well, your journey's not over yet.
Oh God. Okay.
The next pigment that we're going to talk about that originated sort of, I think it was in the 1700s, 1800s, is we see reports of a shade of brown that being used. Think of velvety sort of, what's his name? Rembrandt. Velvety sort of dark Rembrandt brown that's kind of grayish, but it's very, I think of it as like velvet, like a fresh baby puppy. That's brown.
Yeah.
And people are like, yeah, so by the way, this pigment is made out of mummies. And the way that historians can sort of place together how this happened is that in ancient times, not ancient times, but in historic times, pardon me for always saying ancient times, but that's because the things that I study are usually 5,000 years ago. We're talking only now 300 years ago. So in not so ancient times, people associated bitumen as something that was good for you. They would want to have it in the apothecary. And they also thought incorrectly that mummies had so much bitumen in them, which is why I think maybe you've talked about this before, that people would grind up mummies and use it for medicine. Yes. It's sort of, people had apothecaries sort of also working with pigments to some extent, because some of these things did overlap a little. And how it sort of came out is that you've got these mummies from Egypt, which are mummified bodies of real people who intended to stay that way and not be disturbed, being ground up and turned into medicine some people were like, yeah, this is great, because Egyptomania was in full swing at the time. Yeah. This is when you have early archaeologists with big old quote marks who aren't really archaeologists, basically just taking things and putting them in the British Museum, essentially. And mummies were part and parcel of that. And so there are some reports of some people were like, ooh, they're made of mummies. This is great. And the demand for it really went up. And there were some people that were like, I don't think about that. For example, the author Rudyard Kipling, his great uncle was apparently so put off by this that he took his little tube of paint and buried it in his yard because he was like, Not good.
I
But
don't like that. Yeah. Like I'm just gonna
exactly. So, but I'll put a caveat in here for you. Here's an ask. They have done studies, like scientific studies with the space lasers, like I mentioned before,
Yeah.
on both mummies and mummy brown, and
Mhm.
it's not conclusive that mummy brown is actually made of mummies.
Oh, thank goodness.
So it may have been, but we can't conclusively say yes, it was.
Yeah.
But some of them don't really differ all that much on a chemical basis from other brown pigments that are being made at the time.
Uh-huh.
So it could have been that there was very few mummies, but lots of people wanted mummy browns. They kind of just made brown and sold it that way.
Yeah.
But the thing is that it might be hard to tell because the mummification process was so variable that like one individual could have been mummified in a mummy mix, let's say, that was different than another. So mummy brown is one pigment that I think it's got like flashing marquee lights by it when you talk about pigments and being weird and stuff. But asterisk, it may not actually be made of mummies. We don't know yet.
Second asterisk, may be made out of different mummies than other mummies.
Yeah, there was like some things that I had read that said that most of the mummies that were used weren't even ancient. They were recently deceased people that they made to look mummified, which is a whole nother level of messed up because just don't desecrate dead bodies.
Yeah.
Like this is basically why we use synthetic colors now, so we don't have to squash or milk sea snails or deal with cow pee, what have you.
Yeah.
So it's a thing. But we're gonna end on, or at least end on my part of my before I want to ask any questions, etc. on another fascinating color story. And it's not about one specific pigment so much as an entire color family. And that color is the color green. So yeah, exactly. We're both wearing shades of green. Exactly.
Look at us.
Love green. And I think this is really interesting because there were green pigments that were used. We mentioned verdigris, and we mentioned I didn't mention it, but another one that was used in ancient times by the Egyptians was malachite, which is again sort of a blue-green color. Yeah. But we think about, so green is a thing, and obviously green is all around us. People are trying to use it. And on top of these mineral pigments, the verdigris that's synthetic and the malachite, there's also like green that you can get from plants. Yeah. And green you can get from different types of dirt and ash. And these are called earth pigments. So green, and that's what they are. But these, for the longest time, really, a lot of the greens that could be used as pigments and dyes or painting, whatever, were like not very vibrant and they didn't last very long. So that was a thing. But Western culture, we're talking about the post-classical period. So like medieval times, think like Black Plague type eras, think Monty Python's. Yeah. So that's the time period we're going to talk about. But when you think of the color green, what do you think of?
When I think of the color green?
Like common associations of the color green.
Common associations of the color green, like if I'm thinking like an emotion like envy or like the forest. The forest is green. Yeah.
Growth, plants.
Yeah.
Money sometimes.
Yeah. Oh, money for sure. Yeah.
So this is all super common because we have these sort of aspects of growth. We can talk about being green, like ecologically friendly.
Yeah, that's true.
Western culture specifically, we do have these negative associations with the color green, like evil or envy or toxicity. And, you think about it like, what color is the Wicked Witch of the West's face? Green. Elphaba's green.
She is.
You think about toxic sludge, that's often depicted in artwork as like neon green. You have like the bad guys in Harry Potter, all of their spells are green, right?
Green. That's right.
My personal favorite that my husband and I, where we love Star Trek, and so we'll always point out when it's the nemesis in Star Trek, the Borg, which are like, for those who don't know, and if you don't know, I highly recommend finding out, but all of the lights on their ships inside are green. Oh, there's green lights because they're Borg and they're evil. Think of green as evil and bad and having all of these negative connotations. And there's some really interesting thoughts about that. Yeah. And part of that comes from the toxicity bit we'll talk about is because some greens were very toxic, but also because of this association of green and alchemy. And pearls, friends, mixing things together.
Witchcraft.
So we're going to talk, remember the Greeks and how they had like some weird ideas about color. So the writer Plato was like want to know how you get green, like the color of leeks green?
Yeah.
You mix together black and red, and that's how you get green.
I'm sorry.
And so there was already a lot of issues about how do you make this color. But then
Mhm.
when you get into this post-classical period, the medieval times, there were some very strong ideas about mixing things together. And it goes back to alchemy, because as we know, alchemy is witchcraft. Witchcraft is the devil because they're not following Jesus.
Exactly.
So mix things together. And in fact, it went so far as to say that there were guild restrictions. So people who worked with blue and black dyes were in one guild. And I think this is definitely European. I think it may even be England specifically. But they had the blue and black dye making people in one guild, and then people who were making red and yellow dye in a different guild. Cannot be messing with the other stuff that is not in your guild.
Oh,
and
no.
Were found to have been like a blue dyer who was using yellow also and mixing it together to make green. Perished the thought you would be fined and possibly exiled.
Scandal.
Scandal, it's bad. You don't want that. Green is witchcraft. And of course, we could talk about this is not the case across the board. It was not a huge, continent of people cursing green as they walk by. Because we talk about the Sumptuary Laws again. But in England, it was more about, in Europe, more generally, it was like, okay, so you have the priests not wearing red because they're like Catholic, probably.
Yeah.
That was a color that was associated with that. And the nobles wearing purple. And the peasants wearing gray and brown because they are poor and they can't have nice things, which, as we know, is still an attitude held about poors today.
Yeah.
We also had the merchant class wearing green. And these were probably earth pigments, but it wasn't it wasn't as if across the board people were like, green is bad, but, it did have this connotation from way back in the day of being kind of a naughty thing, kind of a bad thing, kind of a witchcraft sort of a suspicious thing. And as I mentioned, these green earth pigments were weak. They didn't last very long. They weren't very bright. So you get the additional layer of negativity added to greens when in the 18th, 19th century, people are like, you know what? We want a brighter green. And all of a sudden, these scientists come on the scene and they're like, hey, I got a brighter green from you. We got our arsenic compounds again. This time, yeah, exactly.
Arsenic.
Exactly. Copper arsenic compounds this time. And so some examples of this would be the color Shields green or Paris green or emerald green. There are lots of in this family that were emerald compounds. But for a while in ye old Victorian times in England, green was very in fashion, and particularly for women's clothing and for home furnishings. Like a big way that this was often incorporated into homes was through wallpaper.
Oh.
And you could get arsenic poisoning simply from existing in the same room. So you have all kinds of reports of people who are like, yeah, so I just wallpapered my new study with this beautiful green in fashion wallpaper. And they start getting sick. They start like having abdominal pains and headaches and exhaustion and dizziness. And then some people, they're like, I wonder if it's the new wallpaper. And they take it away and then they're fine. But then there are also reports of like, you think about this, all right, so if I have an arsenic green dress in my body, that's obviously not a good thing. And some people were more sensitive to it than others. So there's reports of like a nursery being wallpapered with these arsenic green compounds and like children dying from this or being wrapped in green dyed paper. And, people are getting arsenic poisoning from the color green. I know. It's just like, so it's poisonous. And eventually people did sort of catch on to this and new green compounds were made that are not poisonous, which is good. Because green can't really catch a break here.
Yeah. No, green.
Poor green went from mixing things together like the devil, and now it's killing people. And we just want nice things. We want to wear a good forest green, okay? Maybe a chartreuse, like and all these things. Chartreuse, by the way, the color was named after a specific type of alcohol that was made in France by monks, which was called chartreuse. And it's that color. I have seen it at stores.
Whoa.
But yeah, so that's green. And I think it's super interesting to think about just because some of this connotations goes back to like the Middle Ages when people were getting weird about other people mixing stuff together because how dare you combine things and make something new? And then of course some of it is related to other much more tragic things. And I personally am a great lover of the color green, so I have nothing against it personally.
Yeah.
But now you can sort of see perhaps, oh, it's associated with sickness, toxicity, envy, bad things, evil things. So
interesting. I love this. Like I just put on this green dress today because I like the color green.
I also like green.
Right? And it's so interesting to stop and think about like the history behind all of the colors that surround us. The green that I put on, the green that you put on, the pigment in my gallery wall back here. Like what just so much history around us.
The wild thing is I just barely skimmed the surface. I got greatest hits here.
I have something cool that I learned a while ago because I love kimonos. I love kimono history. There's some methods of kimono making and pigment making in Japan that we don't have access to that information anymore, and we don't know how some of the patterns
One thing that I learned, was really across the board. Pigment making was very proprietary. It was people's livelihood. It was all of the industry, so they would closely guard these secrets. And we kind of see this play out a little bit today in the modern world with like copyrighted colors. Like I think of right off the bat, Vanta Black by Anish Kapoor. The blackest black. You've seen this on the internet. It's come up as
where like they paint it and it like becomes like a black hole, basically. Yeah.
And so that's a proprietary color. And so it's some of these things are closely guarded, and even more so in pre-industrial times when it was literally not a company, but like one guy. So tell us,
a dude,
one guy. It's the color guy. So more about the kimonos.
Yeah. So what I was learning, I was watching a lecture by the Met. P.S. And by the way, the Met puts on free like lectures and they upload them onto YouTube. So if you're looking for like 2-hour-long lectures on very niche topics, go to the Met's YouTube channel and you'll find it. So I was watching this one about kimono pigments and how it's really easy, air quotes, easy to date when certain pigments came into Japan from Europe and other parts of Asia and the Americas because woodblock printings, ukiyo-e, like one that I have here, they're dated. They're always dated. So you have the date, sometimes even down to like the day, if not the month. And you can line up all of these different prints and see what new pigments are brought in. And so you can almost track down to the exact year and month when new pigments were brought in because they are first used on ukiyo-e prints and then they're used on kimonos. So you can see.
That's so cool.
Isn't it so cool?
Thank you, historic Japanese artisans, for dating things and giving people like us who are interested in history and art to pinpoint when this happened.
Right? It's so nice. I love talking about niche things like this and getting
for a niche.
And it's so fun. It's so fun. And then you can stop and think about all of the different ways like pigment impacts your life and how the history of pigments are happening. And it kind of makes me really appreciative of the people who made synthetic pigments. So now I don't feel as much guilt about wearing purple.
Right? Like it's a beautiful shade of purple. I think one of the articles that I sent for you as a source has an image of like this beautiful red, purple, almost iridescent like fabric that's been dyed with this Tyrian purple, and it's beautiful, and I understand why it caused a stir in the ancient world. But yeah, I would really rather not be wearing either milked or crushed snail mucus on myself personally, just for fashion. I mean, for health, that's different.
Yeah. Exactly. I don't want the souls of 20,000 snails haunting me while I wear a purple skirt.
Exactly. You know, I'm all about ghosts. I'm all about snails. I am in the banana slug club. I love banana slugs. But yeah, I don't really support killing them for fashion purposes just to be purple. I also really smell like dead fish and pee.
Yes. So that was one of the questions that popped up in my brain is how long does this smell linger? Like, are you always smelling like pee? Or like, what is going on?
First of all, we have to, sort of zoom back a bit and recognize that hygiene standards and norms differ over different places and different times. Because those standards were different, people would have grown up knowing that, like, oh, if I sniff my mama's very fancy purple robes, they're going to smell bad. But, you think about climate's dry enough, things dry out in the sun, the odor will dissipate, I would imagine. But what I do know is that like dye works were very like noxious, smelly areas. So they were put on the outskirts of the city. They were not like a desirable place to want to live next to. I'm glad that I don't have to be around to find out how bad the Tyrian blue dye works smelled and how smelly things were for how long. My delicate olfactory senses were not designed for that. Not the standard of living they've come to accept.
Yes, I feel you. I 100% feel you. We really, really could just go on and on and on about colors and pigments, but Hannah needs to end her day and feed her cat, and I need to
feed my cat.
Lucy Goosey needs her food, and I have to go teach a class right after this. So we have got to go, but I want to say thank you so much again, Hannah, for coming on. I really appreciate it. Delicious donuts, dear ones. This is not the last time you will hear from Hannah. We're best friends now. And
I have many, many things that I wish to delight and or discuss TK with, depending on the topic.
And we're here for all of it, delight and disgust. So thank you so much once again, Hannah. We absolutely love to have you here as our resident archaeologist. Is just your official title.
Again, I love colors. I love them.
We're so happy to have you. So I will see you, Delicious Donuts, in the outro, and we'll see you later, Hannah. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us in this episode, dear one. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a rating, a review, all of those things that help the algorithm know other history BFFs should be here learning about pigments with us. This is the very last guest episode for the in-between season. We have one more episode next week before we start with season 10 that comes out on January 3rd. I am so excited. If you'd like to join me for the premiere drop on January 3rd, you are more than welcome to join me over on the U of the Tube. And I won't keep you for any longer. We chatted for a really long time, Hannah and I. So before I let you go, I will tell you to drink your water, do something kind for yourself. I know the holidays can be very stressful, but please make sure that you take some time for you to decompress, to relax, eat a vegetable, and drink your water. And I will see you next week. Okay, I love you so much. Later. Bye. Why is there a metronome right now? Oh, okay.